Okay, whatever you're thinking about doing, don't do it. Sir?
What would you choose if you could choose anything? What if you could choose everything? So I was working on an essay about Whiplash, one of my favorite movies of the last couple of decades.
Why do you suppose I just hurled a chair at your head, Neiman?
When I finally got around to seeing Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and it was so interesting and so rich with ideas that I actually put Whiplash on the back burner. I want to start by saying that I have mixed feelings about this movie. I love it when it's doing this. And I find it kind of boring when it's doing this. Which is to say that I like it when it's being sincere, and I kind of really don't care for it that much when it's being clever. But thankfully, even though initial impressions might lead you to believe that this is a movie that's all style and no substance, in reality, it's the opposite. Beneath this movie's Hollywood exterior, there's a film with real heart, and that's what I want to talk about today. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, which will henceforth be referred to as EEAO to save on, well, to be perfectly honest, to save on the amount of my finite life that I'm going to have to spend recording and editing this. EEAO follows a day in the life of Evelyn Wong, a Chinese immigrant who runs a laundromat with her husband Wayman, and things are not going well. Her laundromat is in disrepair, her husband is preparing to divorce her daughter hates her, and her judgmental father, who has never approved of her, has come to visit. To top it all off, she's being audited by the IRS. Because they're the people that audit people. Oh god, I gotta start proofreading better. Anyway, all of this drama, however, is immediately dwarfed when in the middle of their visit to the IRS office, Evelyn's husband is possessed by the consciousness of a version of her husband from a different universe. This person, whom we eventually come to know as Alpha Wayman, explains that Evelyn's whole world, and in fact every world in every universe of the multiverse, is currently threatened by a grave evil, Java Tabuli. Nope, that's not right.
Jobu
Tupaki. Jobu Tupaki, a godlike entity who is capable of experiencing the entire multiverse at any given moment. Because so many of the characters in this film are the same people from different universes, it gets messy when you're trying to talk about them, so to avoid this confusion, I'm going to refer to all of the characters of the universe that the movie opens on with the prefix Omega, because, well, I gotta say something, and also I like the idea of calling Joy Omega Joy. Evelyn is understandably skeptical, but Alpha Wayman puts what looks like a couple of oversized earbuds on her, and he hits a button, which causes Evelyn to see her entire life and all of the major decisions that have led her to where she is. The most important of these decisions was her choice to marry Wayman and to move to America. As Alpha Wayman later explains, of all the Evelyns in the universe, the Evelyn of our story is uniquely qualified to confront this evil. The way that these universe jumpers acquire power is by jumping to the bodies of versions of themselves that possess those abilities, by performing bizarre actions which can shoot them off into alternate realities. These actions can include things as simple as putting your shoes on the wrong feet, to taking your dad's snot that's dripping from his face and putting it in his mouth. Which is either grim or hilarious, depending on your sensibilities. Our Evelyn is gifted in this respect because she is, according to Wayman, the worst version of herself in all of the multiverse, and is therefore capable of recruiting skills from other Evelyns because all of them are living better lives than she is, and this makes it easier for her to resonate with them, or something.
You have so many goals you never finished, dreams you never followed. You're living your worst you. I can't be the worst.
I know it's a nitpick, but this is so obviously not true because we later found out that there's this version of Evelyn who is still working as one of those sign spinner people that you used to see in like the early 2000s. for a pizza place in her 50s, and I'm sorry, but there's just no standard by which that is not a worse outcome. Anyway, the film is drenched in Matrix references, the most salient of which is
Kung Fu.
Kung Fu. While trying to leave the IRS building, Evelyn is attacked by a powered-up version of Jamie Lee Curtis, who by the, just so it's understood, in every movie that I see her in, Jamie Lee Curtis just plays herself. She is just Jamie Lee Curtis. The characters are irrelevant. It's always Curtis. In order to escape from Jamie Lee Curtis, Evelyn has to leap to a universe where she knows martial arts. In this world, which I'm going to call the Sigmaverse because it ends up being one of kind of the big four, Evelyn never left China. She rejected Wayman's proposal and was taken under the wing of an obvious Quentin Tarantino reference. With her martial arts prowess, she becomes a successful actress and is surrounded by beauty, wealth, attention, and all the other accoutrements of success. Everything that our Evelyn has always wanted and never had. You see, one of the greatest sources of Evelyn's unhappiness is that she never managed to make it in any of the various interests that she's had over the years. Singer, novelist, chef, teacher, coach, some kind of massage, I don't know. All of these many efforts to improve her life have ended in failure. Evelyn's life up to this point seems to be a story of thwarted desire. Her consciousness returns to the Omegaverse, where she uses her newly acquired Kung Fu to beat the hell out of Jamie Lee Curtis. Afterwards, Wayman is stunned, but all Evelyn can say is that she had seen her life without him, and it was beautiful. This might seem like an incredible, painful thing for Wayman to hear, and it is.
Emotional damage!
But luckily, Alpha Wayman takes the wheel and gets them moving again. He explains that in his universe, Joy had been an exceptionally gifted multiverse traveler, but Alpha Evelyn had pushed her too far and broken her mind. This is kind of a not too subtle jab at the cultural trend of Asian tiger moms, but we'll just keep moving on. Alpha Wayman claims that this version of Joy now experiences all universes simultaneously and has become Jobu Tupaki. But it seems more accurate to say that she functions like the protagonist of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, a chaplain's assistant in World War II who becomes unstuck in time. Becoming unstuck means that he can transport himself with his full knowledge of all events that he's experienced to any point in his life, but he can't change anything in the past. Wherever he goes, he just has to re-experience it as it happened the first time. It seems that, in a similar way, Joy also has come loose, not from time, but from her location in the multiverse, except that she retains the full ability to act in all other universes. For reasons that are not yet entirely clear, this has caused her to become an insane force of destruction, wreaking havoc across the multiverse and building some kind of cult, the sign of which is the black circle on the forehead. We also know that she is pursuing Omega Evelyn, for some reason that nobody can tell. Evelyn and Alpha Wayman get moving again, but right before they do, Evelyn travels back to the Sigmaverse, where she encounters Sigma Wayman at a gala or a ball or something, and she sees that he too is doing pretty well for himself in this universe without her. It seems like in this life, both of them have everything they lacked in the Omegaverse, except they don't have each other, and they don't have joy. Get it? One thing for which the film deserves loads of credit is just how much it does with its runtime. Getting Neo from blue-pilled normie to savior of humanity took the entire length of the first Matrix film. EAO does the same thing in its first act and manages to do so without feeling rushed, possibly because the entire film is shot through with this kind of bubbly, frantic energy. In the second act, Evelyn has a series of confrontations with Alpha Joy, aka Tupaki, who eventually reveals her universe-destroying superweapon, the bagel. As Tupaki explains, one day, Alpha Joy decided to put everything on a bagel.
All my hopes and dreams, my old report cards, every breed of dog, every last personal ad on Craigslist.
While this is played for laughs as a pun, there's a kind of beauty to the idea. But in order to explain it, I'm going to have to introduce a concept called modernity. Now, while most people would hear this word and just assume that it refers to the historical period that we're currently living in, modernity is actually something much more specific. Just a cursory glance at the Wikipedia page ought to make it pretty clear that there are lots of people who have lots of different ideas about it, but if I could sum it up, I would say that modernity begins with the Enlightenment in the 16th century and the belief that reason can be trusted to lead man to a golden age. It eventually reaches a crisis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, primarily as the result of 2 world wars and 3 men, Charles Darwin, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. Together, these men created a kind of rationalist bomb that would shatter the spiritual and philosophical foundations of the entire Western Enlightenment project. What's astonishing is that this crisis took the rest of the 19th and 20th centuries to mature. Only the most highly privileged and educated classes were even able to have access to this mind bomb, and it took a very long time before this knowledge could work its way from the elite to the everyman. Keep in mind, these works are very challenging, and around the time when they were being written, only 40% of English citizens could read at all. But on top of that, there was also the fact that the ruling interests in society recognized the threat that this mind bomb posed to religion, which they understood as being vitally necessary to the functioning of society. Without religion, society would be threatened by anomie, a concept popularized by Emile Durkheim in his important work Suicide. Anomie refers to a social condition in which a loosening or erosion of moral standards creates confusion and alienation in the populace, preventing individuals from being able to integrate with society and adhere to social norms. Durkheim examined this phenomena in relation to the increase in suicidality in France during the 1800s, but many other authors have written on the social utility of religion. The most important recent example that I can think of is Jonathan Haidt in his 2012 The Righteous Mind. In his religious writings and his writings on the function of art, Tolstoy frequently asserts that religion, as it is commonly understood, is a tool encouraged by ruling elites who no longer believe in it themselves, but recognize its usefulness. One hears the same sentiment echoed in Marx's claim that religion is the opiate of the masses. Marx naively assumed that politics could replace everything that people got from religion, but other minds saw further. No one understood this better than writers like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, who saw that the death of God would lead mankind into nihilism, the confrontation between mankind and the godless universe. Before that crisis, the meaning of the world and people's place in it rested on the shoulders of the Judeo-Christian God, but also on the sense that there was a kind of circular nature to life, which lent it a sense of closure. In his essay, Science as a Vocation, Max Weber was able to observe that the notion of scientific progress itself robbed people of this sense of completeness and meaning because now people's lives were measured along an infinite process of increasing scientific knowledge, which might at any point make the knowledge of yesterday irrelevant. Joy alludes to something like this during the rock conversation. The mind bomb detonated sometime around the close of the 20th century, ending modernity and launching us into post-modernity, in which there are basically no sources for enduring meaning and even reason has taken the form of an Ouroboros, deconstructing and devouring itself. Religion still has its adherents, but very few people take it seriously. It has, for the most part, been reduced to what people like Philip Rieff called a therapeutic commitment, a commitment taken on for the benefit of the individual, not one in which the individual serves a force that they recognize as superseding their own desires. And so many of us must bear the burden of feeling that our existence is grounded in nothing, or at best, according to the existentialists, it is grounded in something which we have to supply for ourselves, by either a leap of faith or an act of will. In creating the bagel, Alpha Joy takes all the weight of existence, and since in a meaningless universe no object can be of greater significance than any other, she places it on a bagel. But only God can bear the weight of existence, and so the bagel, overloaded with this weight, collapses in on itself and becomes something like a black hole of meaning. And where actual black holes are, in reality, objects of incredibly dense mass, the donut is an actual void that threatens existence. In her first encounter with Tupaki, Evelyn is on the verge of being sucked into this void, when Alpha Gong Gong appears to rescue her. Apparently he's the head of the multiversal organization that Alpha Wayman is involved in, and this organization actually has enormous reach, with numerous agents capable of inhabiting their counterparts in various universes. Tupaki blips back to the Alphaverse so she can attack Wayman, and at this point, Alpha Gong Gong tells Evelyn that she has to kill her daughter.
Quickly, while she is distracted.
This, he explains, is standard protocol in order to remove one source of power from Tupaki. Really, this is pointless because Tupaki's power comes from being able to access the infinite multiverse, and infinity minus 1 is always infinity. In fact, infinity minus any number that is not infinity is still infinity. So this is literally useless, but that's not the reason that Evelyn refuses to kill her daughter. She refuses because she loves Joy. She loves her enough to risk the fate of the universe on her. Get it? Do you get it? Alpha Gong Gong does not appreciate this one bit. He represents the rigid regime of prudence. In any given situation, he has to angle for the most utilitarian solution. In contrast, Evelyn represents a kind of romantic nature that is willing to risk utility and safety on a greater ideal. Gong Gong brings in a team of agents to subdue Evelyn, but she overpowers them by performing more and more extreme jumps, which she believes will make her powerful enough to stop Tupaki. Soon she gets the chance. After Evelyn subdues all the members of Gong Gong's team, Tupaki kills Alpha Waymond in the Alphaverse and then confronts Evelyn in the Omegaverse, who claims that she has now increased her powers enough to beat Tupaki. But before she can throw a punch, her mind shatters. She pukes, collapses, and then dies. But her consciousness is miraculously transferred to Sigmaverse Evelyn, who is watching these events unfold as a movie in a packed theater. She panics, jumps around a little bit, and is eventually returned to a universe that is basically identical to the Omegaverse, but where the day has unfolded normally. Essentially, everything that happened after their meeting at the IRS office never happened here. I guess we'll call this the Betaverse. It's the evening, and the party that Evelyn had been talking about that morning is about to get started. Joy and Becky come in, and Evelyn drops out Tupaki, only to discover that Tupaki doesn't want to fight. Eventually, Tupaki explains that she created the donut out of despair, hoping she might be able to use it to kill herself. And at this point, it's really not possible to avoid discussing Camus. And okay. So look, obviously there's always going to be a new crop of humans discovering all this stuff for the first time, and that means that ideas are always new to somebody. And if that somebody is you today, this is not to disparage you. Instead, this is to welcome you to the rest of your life, where you are slowly going to grow to hate Camus. Not for anything that he did or said, but for how exhausting it is going to become to have to watch people discover him and think that they just came up with a solution to world hunger or invented masturbation. So keep on watching if you want to experience that frustration forever, I guess. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. So begins Camus' book-length essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942. He devotes the rest of it to answering that question. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was a king who attempted to cheat death, and as punishment, he was condemned to spend eternity pushing a boulder up a mountain in the underworld. Every time he would reach the top, the boulder would slip loose and roll back to the foot of the mountain, and Sisyphus would have to return to the base to begin his task again. This myth symbolized for Camus the futility and frustration of an absurd existence. He described existence as absurd because of the great contradiction between mankind's need for some kind of meaning and the universe's refusal to give him any. For Camus, without God, human life lost all meaning because no human decision mattered in the light of eternity. Anything that you could do would eventually be forgotten, any consequence would eventually be erased by the grand tides of causality. Alpha Joy comes to the same conclusion by recognizing that for any decision that she can make, there's another universe where she made the opposite decision, and the significance of life, or any choice, is lost within the infinity of alternatives, rather than in the waters of infinite time. This has a certain resonance for us in our age of social media and the attention economy, where a rapid-fire onslaught of different emotions and messages all compete for our attention at any given moment, and where we are granted at any instant a practically infinite number of choices for where we can direct our attention. But having all of these options available has a way of making it seem as if none of them matter. As Joy explains all of this, she also reveals that her plan was never to kill Evelyn. Instead, she was hoping that she would be able to do for Evelyn what her Evelyn in the Alphaverse once did for her, to push her past her limit. More than Alpha Joy wants to destroy existence, she wants to find someone who can see existence the way she sees it. Basically, this whole time, Joy's been trying to force-feed Evelyn this ultimate black pill, and eventually she succeeds. Evelyn, realizing the futility of all choice, of all her efforts to hold her family and her fragile life together, experiences total despair. She's been working so hard to keep all of the plates of her life spinning that when she finally stops trying, there is a perverse pleasure in watching everything come crashing down. As Evelyn reaches this point of total despair, she joins Joy in a different universe where they are both two stones sitting on top of a mountain. Here, the allusion to Camus is as obvious as it ever could be, and Joy finally explains to Evelyn that the purpose in blackpilling her was to create a companion, someone who could see existence the way she saw it because she was hoping against hope that Evelyn might be able to show her something that she had missed, some escape from the despair of nihilism. But Evelyn finds that she too has been conquered by that despair, and both stand before the awe and terror of the bagel, ready to end the agony of their absurd existences together. That is, until Evelyn's attention is momentarily pulled away as she notices that Waymond is talking to Jamie Lee Curtis in the Betaverse. Oh, I just realized that I left this part out, but it actually matters. At the end of their morning meeting with Jamie Lee Curtis, Curtis tells them that they can go and that they have until 6 p.m. that night to get the documents that she needs to her. In this retelling of the Omegaverse story, Evelyn hasn't done that, and so Curtis shows up with the cops. I'm pretty sure this isn't how it works, but it's good TV or whatever. And when Evelyn takes a bat to one of her windows, she gets cuffed. Okay, I think we're up to speed now. Suddenly, Curtis tells the cops that they can release Evelyn and walks out of the store. Evelyn asks Waymond what's going on, and Waymond explains that Curtis is giving them another week to get their taxes in order. When Evelyn asks him how he did it, he says, "I just talked to her." At the same time, in the Sigma universe, Waymond is explaining that his radical optimism is not actually a weakness, even if it appears so, but it is in fact a deliberate strategy.
我总是看到事情好的一面，那不是因为我天真，而是必要和需要。这也就是我的生存之道。
The googly eyes that Waymond has been annoying Evelyn with for this entire movie end up being a representation of Waymond's spiritual essence. This extraordinary capacity to see all things as deserving consideration, of desiring communion with all of existence, even inanimate objects. At the moment of final conflict, when all of the forces of Alpha Gong Gong are arrayed against Evelyn, in a stunning about-face, silly, stupid Waymond is finally unveiled as the archetype of the great soul.
I don't know what the heck is going on, but somehow this feels like it's all my fault.
This statement coming from Waymond is flatly absurd. The forces at work in this moment are so far beyond his comprehension, let alone his control, that it's just laughable that he could feel or imagine himself responsible for it. But this is simply the nature of the great soul, who feels compelled to take all the world, all of existence onto himself, to answer everything with a yes. Tupaki tries to call Evelyn's attention back to the bagel, but Evelyn, inspired to hope again by Waymond's example, refuses. Tupaki, however, is undeterred and points out the futility of hope before making her way to the bagel to end her existence. At this point, Alpha Gong Gong now runs interference for Tupaki against Evelyn, because in his mind, if Tupaki kills herself, the crisis will be ended. He doesn't realize that the bagel has become the true enemy. He and his agents open fire on Evelyn, who pulls a Neo, stopping all of the bullets, and even plucking one of them from against her forehead where it spins impotently. As she examines it, the bullet becomes one of Waymond's googly eyes, which he places on her forehead. Those familiar with Eastern spiritual traditions will immediately recognize this allusion to the third eye of Hinduism and Buddhism. The third eye, sometimes known as the Ajna Chakra, signifies enlightenment, spiritual sight, and the subconscious mind, which is our direct link to what Hindus called Brahman, ultimate reality and ultimate truth. Evelyn uses her newly acquired spiritual gifts to reflect all of the bullets back at her assailants, but the bullets too have been transformed into googly eyes. She then wades in, dispatching each of them not by harming them, but by satisfying their needs and desires, finally arriving at Tupaki. The two of them fight across various universes, eventually arriving back at the Betaverse, where Joy insists that Evelyn has got to let her go, and that it's simply too painful for them to be around each other. Concurrently, in the Omegaverse, Evelyn, who, with the help of her entire family, has been trying to restrain Tupaki from throwing herself into the void, finally listens and releases her, and Tupaki slides into the bagel's whirlpool of nihilism. And it seems like Joy will be lost, but at the last moment, Betaverse Evelyn turns around, and she begins to criticize Joy for not watching her weight, for not calling, for getting a tattoo even though she knows Evelyn hates it, and Joy finally confesses to her mother, the source of her despair, her failure to make anything of herself. Both Joy and Evelyn share this pain of feeling like they haven't made good with their lives. And Evelyn, now that she's been through her own journey, is able to give Joy this assurance that she is not a source of shame for her mother. And after realizing that Joy has suffered from the same sense of inadequacy that's haunted Evelyn for her entire life, Tupaki's hand emerges from the void, and Evelyn takes it, pulling her into an embrace and assuring Joy that there is no other place that she would rather be than with her daughter. The movie ends with Evelyn and her family returning to the IRS office where Jamie Lee Curtis is, with the cantankerousness mollified by compassion, explaining once again the mistakes that they have made on their taxes. And Evelyn looks at the members of her family in loving amazement, as if unable to believe how lucky she is. There's a reason that the story begins and ends in only one universe, despite the fact that theoretically the entire multiverse is available. The purpose of Evelyn's adventure, the purpose of the archetypical hero's journey, is to effect a psychological or spiritual change in the hero, and then return them to the place where they started. This is why, for instance, the adventures of both Frodo and Bilbo return them at last back to the Shire. This is why the hero's journey is meant to reflect the operation of real art. To the extent that art aspires to be something more than escapism or simple entertainment, it has to perform a certain operation of edifying its audience. Great art performs this trick of picking up the viewer and placing them in a realm of fiction and fantasy. And while in this world within the world, the artist guides the viewer through a series of experiences which in the end is intended to bring them to some kind of greater consciousness, whether by intellectual, emotional, or spiritual growth. Once this has been done, the viewer is returned to the world outside of the artwork, hopefully having gained something in the process. Though Everything Everywhere All at Once puts a modern spin on the concept, Evelyn's journey is not that dissimilar to those of characters like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, or Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Despite its pretensions to be a story of grand scope and consequence, involving all life in all possible universes, EEAO is actually a family drama, and all of the major players are taken from one family. Evelyn is the one who discovered the multiverse, and also the one who is destined to rescue the multiverse. Her daughter, Joy, is the one threatening to bring the whole thing down. Her husband and father are the two leaders of the resistance. Beneath all the clever irreverence of its exterior, under the hood, this is a story about a young woman in crisis, turning to her mother, who is also in crisis, to save her one last time. In order to rescue Joy, Evelyn has to resolve her own crisis, and realize the extent to which her crisis is the same as her daughter's. And in rescuing Joy in one universe, she saves her for all of them. All of this is, I think, more or less obvious, but I think there's still more that can be gleaned from the film. I want to be clear from the outset that I'm not saying that my interpretation is the interpretation intended by the writers. Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, has been used to excuse a lot of really sketchy literary criticism, but I do think that there is sometimes merit in discussing the themes and meanings which an author did not consciously intend, and I certainly don't think that the themes that jumped out at me from this movie were put there intentionally. But let's get into them. Evelyn's crisis is that her world is falling apart because of a breakdown in social structures and conventions that provide security to people. Evelyn talks frequently about the community, but there doesn't actually seem to be much of one. It's likely that this is simply the projection of a wish. In reality, even the most basic social structures around her are breaking down, and this is represented by Omega Wayman's filing for divorce. It's really not possible to talk about this aspect of the movie without discussing liberalism itself. I should also clarify that I'm not using liberal in the way that it is typically used as being opposed to conservative. In political theory, both of what we today know as liberals and conservatives are really just two different flavors of liberalism. In his 2018 book, Why Liberalism Failed, Patrick Deneen describes liberalism as having a corrosive effect on not just traditional social structures, but all cultural bonds, and replacing them with consumerist market forces and state power. The dissolution of culture is simultaneously the prerequisite for the liberation of the disembedded individual, for a pervasive and encompassing market, and for the empowerment of the state. Individuals appeal to available authorities for a loosening of cultural norms and practices in the name of individual liberation, leading to various pressures that diminish or dissolve the constitutive features of long-standing informal norms. Absent these norms, individuals pursue liberalized liberty, fulfilling the desire to do as one wishes, all that is not restrained by law or causing obvious harm. But without the guiding standards of behavior that were generally developed through cultural practices and expectations, liberated individuals inevitably come into conflict. The only authority that can now adjudge those claims is the state, leading to an increase in legal and political activity in local affairs that were once generally settled by cultural norms. Liberal individualism demands the dismantling of culture, and as culture fades, Leviathan waxes and responsible liberty recedes. Liberalism releases individuals from the informal cultural bonds of duty, using state power to maintain an order that was once upheld by the exercising responsibility by individuals within that culture. Among other examples, Deneen uses the 2008 Wall Street crash to illustrate how avarice and personal ambition, disconnected from consequence, resulted in a catastrophe, and how that catastrophe was, in turn, met with demands for more government oversight and regulatory bodies that had not previously been necessary. Individual duty is eroded and replaced by the power of the state. Ironically, though, desire to escape from the suffocating bonds of community is a big part of how Evelyn has ended up in America. Her relationship with her own culture is disrupted by her rejection of her father's wishes when she leaves and marries Waymond. But release from this culture does not deliver on its promises. Evelyn isn't a celebrity or even a local success story. Her life is falling apart, her daughter barely speaks to her husband is preparing to leave her, and her business is threatened by an audit. It is at this critical moment of weakness that her father, the representation of the culture and social order that she abandoned, has come to visit. And though it is never spoken, her father's "I told you so" hangs over Evelyn's head like a sword of Damocles. Her embarrassment is seen in her efforts to appease her father's wishes, as well as her efforts to hold onto the symbols and accoutrements of her culture, after having denied the heart of that culture. For both Evelyn and her daughter, the promises of liberalism have not materialized, and both of them struggle with that shame. In fact, it is this shame that is behind Joy's crisis. Given that the intellectual foundations of the mind bomb were laid more than a century ago, why is it that a movie made in 2022 about the fallout of that bomb can feel so fresh and original? Simply put, it's because, for everyone but the most educated social elites, the bonds of culture, community, and family were still strong enough that the vast majority of people weren't driven to look for the ultimate meaning in life. The meaning of their lives was bound up in the roles that they were given within their communities. Today, hedonism has stepped in to provide the satisfaction that was once supplied by meaningful commitments, relying on the assumption that as long as life is pleasant, there's no need to ask the deep, dangerous questions. Unfortunately, the human spirit is not so easily bribed, and even if it were, the solution only works to the extent that suffering can be avoided. But as society becomes increasingly atomized and individuals increasingly isolated, fulfillment is increasingly rare, and suffering increasingly common, and we find ourselves driven to ask larger and larger questions, eventually arriving at the big one. What is it all for? As Camus and countless others have already determined, without some religious grounding, life is absurd. Camus' personal solution to this conundrum was for the individual to assert themselves against the absurd universe by living their life in revolt. According to him, this revolt was what gave life meaning. And this might seem like a satisfying solution to a spunky teen, but eventually one begins to suspect that the universe isn't overly impressed with our little rebellion. In fact, it seems like it doesn't care at all, because if it did, then it would no longer be absurd. There would be a sympathy between human needs and the universe's response to them, but this absence of sympathy is the basis of the absurd condition. Eventually, it was not enough for Camus either. 9 years after the myth of Sisyphus, he published The Rebel, which dealt with much the same questions, but attempted to pose an alternative solution, one that sought to cling to those very transcendent values which he had denied in Sisyphus. Camus had planned his life's work in 3 successive stages: the absurd, revolt, and the last stage was love. Shortly before his death, he remarked that he'd only completed about a third of that work, and though he wrote extensively on the absurd and on revolt, we have very little from him on the subject of love. According to his friends, Camus had been fond of claiming that a car crash was the most absurd way to die. Camus died in a car crash in 1946. Afterwards, 144 handwritten pages of an unfinished autobiographical novel titled The First Man were found in the vehicle. These pages were all that Camus would ever give of his thoughts on love. The handwritten dedication, "For you who could never read this book," was for his illiterate mother. Camus had believed it would be his greatest work. And so it's appropriate that Everything Everywhere All at Once should resolve the Sisyphean dilemma with a radical act of love. The power of Evelyn's love for Joy, her refusal to give up pursuing her, is given its measure by the scene in which rock-form Evelyn is able to defy the laws of nature. This is all well and good, and obviously it resonates with me personally, but I think there's still something more interesting going on. Often in our cultural moment, love is treated as if it were simply unconditional affirmation, unlimited acceptance of the love object. But consciously or otherwise, EEAO rejects this notion. "I'm your mother," Evelyn cries at the film's climax. Repositioning Joy within the matrix of meaningful relationships and duties, which is the family. "You are getting fat," another Evelyn says again, and criticizes Joy for not calling and for getting a tattoo. The movie ends by asserting the right for individuals to impose duties on one another. In recent years, it's not uncommon to witness even the closest relationships being jettisoned because people are unwilling to allow impositions to be made on them, despite wishing to make impositions on other people. Or they're unwilling to acknowledge the legitimacy of demands made on them, despite wishing to make demands of other people. As a strategy for living, this can only ever be employed cynically, because it fails Kant's categorical imperative. No one truly believes that even those people they love the most should have perfect freedom to abandon them if the going ever gets tough. If they say they do, it simply shows that they think they will never be reduced to a state of depending on that person. EEAO demonstrates an understanding that this kind of rampant individualism leads us to despair, and that the only escape from that despair is the ability to make meaningful commitments, which are satisfying only because they are costly, because they demand things of us and force us to moderate our own self-seeking. Though it's never explicitly shown, I think there's some awareness that when enough people make these commitments, the end product are those cultural and social institutions which Evelyn had rejected and which her father represents. In this way, the movie shows an inchoate rejection of unbridled individualism and a defensive movement against liberalism. Ultimately, in spite of these minor objections, what makes this movie beautiful to me is its willingness to assert the outrageous with sincerity. If a bagel proves to be insufficient to bear the weight of all existence, EEAO is willing to assert that a mother's love for her daughter, for her husband, is capable of carrying that weight. And even if there is an unlimited diversity of universes in which all possibilities are realized, they matter surprisingly little when it comes down to it. Far more important is the imperative that each of us love our life, not because it's glamorous or impressive or luxurious, but because it is ours. Out of all existence, this is the slice that was gifted to us. And that ought to mean something.